If you have a true scary story you'd like to share with the channel, go to astheravendreams.com and click the button to do so. And of course, thank you. So, this was something that was more bizarre than scary, except for that very moment that it happened, but I wanted to share this with you anyways. Many years ago, I used to work a night shift as a hospital custodian for a few years. Most nights blur together, just me, my cart of supplies, and the ambient sounds of the hospital. Machines whirring and beeping, nurses talking in the distance, and the occasional television. It's actually one of the reasons I can't sleep in silence anymore. I have to have some kind of ambience in the background. I went into the rooms, sometimes there were patients in them and sometimes they were empty. I took out the trash, wiped down surfaces, and did a little housekeeping like replacing towels and extra blankets that were stored in the closets. It was pretty late. I was actually almost done with my shift at that point. I went into the room of an elderly woman who had been there for about 2 weeks. I had cleaned her room a few times prior, so I'd seen her before, even though she was asleep when I saw her. She had some gifts in her room, which consisted of flowers, little stuffies, and those stick balloons. They were typically on the counter by the TV and out of the way, but sometimes I would have to sweep up petals that fell on the ground. And that wasn't just her room, though, that was for all the patients. So, that night, I did my normal routine. As I entered the room, the patient was asleep. Whether they're asleep, awake, in a coma, I let my presence be known so I don't startle them. It's just something as simple as, "Hello, I'm just here to pick up a little," and when I leave, I say, "Have a good night." This patient was never awake or even moved when I was in her room, but I just assumed that she was sedated at night to help her sleep. So I started wiping down the counters, sweeping, emptying the trash containers, and even collecting the hazard buckets. But as I was collecting the small trash can next to her bed, I noticed a Jell-O cup and spoon sitting on the makeshift nightstand. Depending on the time of day and the patient being awake, we could leave the food items there or ask them if they wanted to keep it or toss it. But since it had been several hours since the last round of meals, it was outside of the time we were technically allowed to leave it. We had protocols that said we had to throw out any food items after a certain time, so I went to reach for it to toss it. That's when it started. As I grabbed the cup, I felt an impossibly cold hand touch my elbow. It was enough to startle me and make me jump back. I looked to my left. At my arm, I saw the patient's eyes locked into mine. The whites of her eyes were watery and yellow, but what really stood out to me was how alert she looked. How determined she seemed to get my attention. She very clearly asked me to leave the Jell-O cup for her grandbaby. I apologized and said that I wouldn't touch it, and then smiled at her. She smiled back as she closed her eyes and said, "It's his favorite." I put it back down and pulled out a small notepad that I carried. It was convenient when I needed to remember something later or for situations like this. I wrote a quick note that said, "Do not throw away," and put it under the little green cup. By the time I did this, I turned to let her know, but she was already asleep again. It just confirmed to me that she was probably on something that helped her sleep. I continued cleaning the room and then left the room, letting her know I was leaving. My heart rate dropped back down to normal after that, and I finished my shift with no other major events. The very next night, as I started my shift, I was chatting with some of the nurses as the shifts changed. I overheard 2 of the nurses talking about the patient's grandson eating Jell-O at every visit. I thought the whole situation was pretty cute, so I asked them if that was the patient with that room number, and they confirmed. I mentioned how she startled me as I went to toss the Jell-O, asking me to leave it, which is why I left the note. I'll never forget the looks on their faces. They looked at me like I was talking nonsense. They asked me who told me to leave it, and I confirmed it was the patient, the older woman in the bed. If they didn't know me, I'd think they thought I was lying to them. But one of them told me that the woman didn't speak and, in fact, had been in a medically induced coma due to her condition. I was at a loss for words. She definitely spoke to me. She grabbed my arm and smiled at me. She told me not to take the Jell-O. We were all just at the point of saying, huh, oh, that's weird. Because either we didn't want to believe it, or maybe just think about it, or maybe they did think I was messing with them, but we just dropped it. It stayed in my mind that whole time that I worked that evening. I even cleaned her room again that night, and there was another Jell-O cup. This time it was purple. As I finished, I walked to the cup and wrote another similar note, but I took a shot and softly asked what flavor he preferred, and there was no response. I thought maybe she just felt so strongly about it the night prior that she had to tell me. So I placed the note, and as I started wheeling out my cart, I clearly heard green. I looked over at her and her eyes were closed. Did I really hear that? Was I mistaken? So I went back to my note and wrote green preferred. Maybe it would do something. I didn't know if it would or not. After that night, I was off for 2 days, and work was the last thing on my mind. When I returned, I started on my normal routine, which included stopping and talking to the nurses before I got started. One of the nurses I had talked to about the Jell-O patient approached me and asked me if I was the one that left the note again. I confirmed that I was, and that she once again told me the grandson's favorite flavor. She looked at me surprised and asked me what she said, how she acted, etc. I told her exactly what had happened, which was pretty uneventful in my opinion, other than the fact that she shouldn't have been conscious in the first place. The nurse said that the patient's condition had worsened, and that she had a DNR, so she passed while I was off. But she said that the family had visited again before, and when they saw the note, they actually brought another green Jell-O. She passed after they had left. I was shocked. Obviously, she was in the hospital, so she wasn't healthy, but the fact that she passed after the grandson was there and had the Jell-O was almost a gut punch to me. It was like she waited to enjoy it with him one more time. She had the strength, while in a coma, to wake up and stop me from tossing her grandson's treat. And I can't help to think that that was what she was holding on to. She just wanted to share that moment with him again. Maybe it was his favorite thing. Maybe there was an inside story to it that I'll never know. But while the nurses were still baffled by my experience, I just took it for what it was, and held on to it, knowing that the little cleaner guy may have made that woman's last days just a little bit better. Back in my 20s, I job hopped a lot. I didn't know what I wanted to do after high school, so I certainly didn't want to go to college without a goal in mind. So, until I figured out what I wanted, I worked where I could. I worked in retail and even as a front desk assistant, but this story is about the time that I worked at a gas station. I started working there at nights, which is typically where everyone started. But then you would gain the privilege to go to the day shift if you wanted, or even transfer to another store after 90 days. But as I worked that late shift, I learned that I actually liked it. It was pretty chill compared to the high demand of the retail or grocery stores, and I didn't have to wear heels like I did at the office. The hardest part of my job was probably when I had to tell people that our coffee or soda machines were out of order. I liked the people that I worked with too, which was a benefit. It was almost like we were there to just mess around and talk all night. Most of the nights were like that anyways. So my shift was typically from 3 p.m. to 11 p.m., but sometimes I stayed later, depending on my ride situation. I also had a crappy car, so if it ran, I got home on time. If not, I would have to wait for my boyfriend to come pick me up, and he got off work at around the same time. We always had 2 to 3 people working at the same time, but the other 2 people were typically overnight, with me leaving at 11, so they also couldn't take me home. Store policy was that 2 employees had to be working at all times. The gas station itself is unremarkable. It was a pretty popular one in Oklahoma that was off a pretty popular street that ran parallel with the highway. Needless to say, we got pretty busy in the mornings and in the evenings as people got off work. But by 9 or 10 p.m., it was pretty dead. My last few hours were always a break from the rest of the shift, which was nice. That night, I was manning the register as I usually did. Josie would be coming in a few hours to start her shift, and Carlos was in the freezer stocking stuff. It was quiet, as it normally was, with just a car here or there that would get gas, pay at the pump, and then leave. It was about 10 when I first noticed this car. It was an old dark brown or maroon sedan with tinted windows. It caught my attention because it had been circling the parking lot for about 10 minutes or so. Something that was definitely unusual. It passed by the front of the store a few times, which was even weirder to me. We were a 24/7 gas station, and it was pretty obvious. But just to humor them, if they weren't from the area and not familiar with this specific gas station chain, they could see the store hours on the door when they pulled to the front the first time, and then they would know the hours. There was no reason for them to drive by the front doors multiple times. We even had suspicious cars drive by, like they were casing the place, but as soon as they saw Carlos, or maybe the multiple cameras, or maybe the multiple security cameras, they would just move along. It didn't happen often, but it was still more than once, which didn't make you feel good about it. So, this car had circled multiple times, but they kept coming back, unlike the past experiences. I was concerned it was going to be a similar situation. I hollered for Carlos and had him come up so I could point them out. I explained what I was seeing and he agreed that it was weird. However, we also knew how the store owner was about things like that, so we told each other if they tried to do anything that we would call someone or do whatever we needed to do. The car drove out of the lot again, and I was praying that that was it, that they wouldn't return. Maybe it was just them casing and they were feeling a bit more confident in their abilities. Either way, it seemed like they had given up. But not long after, maybe 15 minutes or so, they were back. This time they stopped by the front doors, and the passenger side rolled down their window. He hung his head out, and at first glance, he looked old. Too old to be doing what he was doing. He had short but curly gray hair and a matching gray beard. He was just staring right at me as he blew a kiss and smiled. I just looked back down at the counter and acted like it was the most interesting thing I'd ever seen. I was looking at the spots and rubbing my fingers on it, like I saw a spot to remove or something. I remember this because I was counting the brown specks that covered the beige counter, and I heard someone trying to do a burnout, and then looked back up to see the car taking off down the road. What the hell were they trying to do? But shortly after that, they were right back in the parking lot, now stopping at a pump. They probably were low on gas with how much they had been circling and idling. But as soon as I saw 3 doors open, I started to get worried. I immediately called for Carlos again, not taking my eyes off the car. The driver stepped out, and began fidgeting with the screen while the guy in the back got out and stood with his back to the car. The passenger got out and immediately did this weird jump shake thing. It was like what I see in movies and shows when someone is about to do something dangerous or stupid. Like he was getting himself amped up. Again, this guy looked like he was in his 70s or something, and was acting like someone my age. Carlos told me to go back to the back and to not come out no matter what. He said if I did hear or see anything to call the cops immediately, and to call Josie to tell her not to come in. I wouldn't have even thought about Josie, honestly. The thought of her showing up and being outside with them gave me the chills. I did what was asked of me, and I went to the back, standing right behind the swinging doors. This way I couldn't see the front, but I could still hear anyone talking or any sounds. The man was whistling and said, "Hola!" to Carlos, who just said, "Hey." I heard the whistling as he walked by the doors and headed to the back, by the soda machines. He then went back to the front, and I heard a crunch, possibly lying something on the counter. Carlos asked if that was it, and all the man said was, "Where'd the little girl go?" Carlos answered, "She's on break." The man's response made my stomach drop. "Aw, I wanted the pretty girl to check me out. When's she coming back?" In a very annoyed tone, Carlos responded, "Will that be all, sir?" I heard what sounded like a bunch of coins being dropped, then followed by the man laughing. He then said, "Adios, amigo," in what I can only describe as being sarcastic, and then I heard the door chime. I waited for a few seconds, and then peeked my head around the corner. I didn't see the man, so I asked Carlos if he was gone, and he confirmed. I came back out and saw Carlos picking up coins from the counter still. Apparently, the man had just tossed some money on the counter and walked out with a bag of chips. He said that he was glad he sent me to the back because seeing that guy face to face was unsettling. One of his eyes was completely gray and clouded. He didn't have any teeth, yet his smile was creepy and his hands were messed up, like dried blood and cuts all over his knuckles. He asked me to call Josie and tell her to call when she got there so that Carlos could meet her at her car. And he said he was actually going to call the cops, too. I knew the guy was creepy, but something else was obviously putting him on edge, and enough so for him to call the cops. After the guys had gotten back in their car, they left the parking lot but were stopped on the side of the street across from the gas station. When the police rolled up without their lights and sirens, that's when that car left and didn't come back. We both explained what we saw, and the cop said that he would do some rounds to see if they did come back. They left so quietly, I don't know if the cop even realized they were there. I remember trying to stress the importance of where they were, trying to convince the cop to go now and that they might catch them if they did, but he wouldn't, saying he had to wait for backup. It was crazy. I never saw that car or those guys again that night, and I was so angry. If they would have paid attention, they might have. Ultimately, they just took our report and said to call them if they came back again. That was the night that I drove myself, and I really wish that I hadn't. Carlos walked me to my car, but I would get distracted by any lights that I saw, paranoid that they may have been following me. But I got home with no incident, and my boyfriend even met me outside, after telling him what happened at work. Carlos had also reported the incident to the owner, since it was required any time the police were called. To my surprise, the owner took it very seriously. They ended up talking to me about it too, and mentioned how they had heard other reports about a suspicious red car driving around and following women. It was always at night, and was when they were alone, locking up or leaving work, leaving a bar or school, sometimes even just walking at night. They would follow them. Sometimes they would ask them for help or ask them to go with them, claiming they knew a place to party, or that they needed help with something in their car. As far as I knew, and what the owner told me, They had never been successful, but they still had a lot of reports from those women. The thought that these guys could have been there for me and not the store, it made me sick. What would have happened if we didn't call the cops? Would they have waited for me to leave? Would they have tried something in the store if they thought I was alone? I still have no idea, and I'm sure that I'll never know. What I do know is that it made me realize some of the vulnerabilities of working at night, and I didn't like the odds as a small female. I ended up changing to days after that until I found another job, and I never looked back. The fun, workless nights we had as employees were nice, but it definitely was not worth my safety. Hi, Raven. I love your stories, your voice, and your obvious kindness. Thank you. This is my first time submitting to you, and I'm excited. I live in the mountains in Australia. My sister and I live together with my kid. It's a peaceful life. My sister is one of those amazing special people. She is a nurse in a palliative dementia ward in the local nursing home. She works the evening shift, and I pick her up at midnight 5 days a week. I sit in my car, in the dark car park, and wait, parking as close to the door as possible so she doesn't have to walk too far. I never go in because the nursing home is locked down every night. A few months ago, it was an extremely windy night. I could see lightning flashing in the distance, illuminating the horizon, but the storm hadn't hit. I was waiting for my sister, who is often late, and watching the approaching storm. The car park was very dark, but in the window of the room next to the nursing home entrance, I saw a dim light brighten and noticed an elderly woman sitting there, looking out. Her eyes met mine, although I wasn't sure how she could see me in my dark car, but her gaze was penetrating. She didn't smile, but nodded, and turned her head back to the room. For a while, she seemed to be talking to someone. I watched her laughing and seemingly communicating, but I couldn't see anyone else in the room. Given that she was a dementia patient, this wasn't out of the ordinary. I was wondering why such a frail lady was awake after midnight, especially knowing that the ward was for extreme presenting and palliative dementia residents. I decided to tell my sister that the woman was in the room before I drove off, but it was getting later and my sister still had not come out. I watched the lady again. She was very pale, white-haired, parchment skin, and was wearing white with a green cardigan. She kept looking at me, certainly seeing me. The storm hit, and then my sister ran out. She jumped in the car, and I greeted her. "Before we go," I said, "is that lady supposed to be in the room there? She seems to be alone." "What lady?" my sister said, immediately in nurse mode again. "In that room," I pointed, but the room looked empty. "There was a lady in there." My sister told me that all of her patients were in bed, or in the living room being attended by care staff. No one was in that room. It's out of bounds to residents. Only their families go in there. She said that the room was the place where the doctors and nurses sat with family whose relatives were at the end stage and were dying. There was no one in there now, and the door is kept locked unless it's needed, which on that night, it wasn't. I described the lady, and my sister said that it was a pretty generic description of many of her patients. However, she did say that strange things happened in her work, and nurses often reported hearing noises in that room when it was locked. I don't know whether I saw a time slip or a spirit, but I know she saw me, and I'll always wonder why she was there that night. I've been working as a commercial cleaner for about a decade now. I know to many it may seem like a weird or undesirable job, but it's actually quite nice. I work overnights. I get to listen to music and podcasts, such as yours, and I usually don't interact with any of the customers. I go into the buildings, clean, disinfect, and sanitize office buildings. Especially after 2020, our business really ramped up. Sometimes we've even gotten calls to clean up some crime scenes. I can't really go into a lot of details on those, but I wish I could. For the most part, it's just the office buildings. It's pretty simple work and I enjoy it. But there was a situation that I was unfortunately involved in back in 2021 that has affected me on the job since. We had a relatively new client, a law office, that started a contract with us in late 2020. They had a small suite previously, but since they added a new partner, they needed a bigger place. So they moved to an old Victorian-style home that had been converted into commercial use. It was surrounded by some nearby stores, all within walking distance, in a pretty popular area. Apparently, it was easier for them to hire cleaners than having janitorial staff, which made sense after cleaning the place a few times. There wasn't exactly enough room for a janitor and all the supplies. The clean was simple enough, though. We swept or vacuumed. In their case, it was mostly sweeping, as they only had a rug at the entrance and in part of their little break room. We wiped down the tables and counters, cleaned the windows, and then sprayed and sanitized pretty much anything that was touched. Handles, knobs, keyboards, you name it. They had a small lobby or waiting area with a check-in desk, 3 offices, what looked like a meeting room, and then the break room and restrooms. I cleaned the whole place on my own in a matter of a few hours. That night wasn't supposed to be any different. I got there at about 2 a.m., and it was dark and empty. As I mentioned, the place was old, so it still made its own share of noises from the creaky hardwood floors and a few of the windows shaking. They were actually in the process of replacing them when we started cleaning for them. I remember because one of the repair guys left a pile of shavings under the window. Anyways, I always started from the back and worked my way to the front. That way all my supplies are near the door. I popped my headphones on and started working on the break room. It was fairly simple, as nothing had been left out and the trash was empty too. I mop once everything else is done, and since that was it for that room, I moved to the meeting room. There is a single filing cabinet with an attached shelf in there that had a stack of various office supplies. Pens, notepads, paper clips, and the filing cabinet was locked. I just dusted when necessary and wiped down the handles. I did notice the supplies seemed to be strewn about, specifically the notepads and those tan folders in the metal holder. They were all empty and unused, but they still looked lopsided, like they'd been shifted or bumped really hard. I just straightened them out and moved on. Then I went to the closest office, one of the lawyers. That's when I immediately noticed something was wrong. The desk looked like a mess. Things were scattered around. The small plant that sat on the desk was now on the floor, knocked over. Papers were scattered around on the desk and floor. Every time I had cleaned this place, they had every piece of paper put away unless it was blank, which made sense, right? They probably had a lot of confidential information, and we had to sign clauses too about not going through anything and reporting if anything was out in plain sight. I didn't immediately see anything on the papers, but I still didn't believe they would have left their office like that. I continued to look over the room to assess it all when I saw the shorter filing cabinet behind the desk. It had a large dent in the front and top of it, like it had been punched or kicked, maybe. I approached it and tried the handle when I noticed, with a clunk, that it opened. It had obviously been locked. You could see the mechanism sticking out of the side. But with how it had been damaged, it warped that part of the lock, so it freely came open. I closed it and looked at the bookshelf on the other side of the wall where I saw many binders had been pulled out and scattered around. The more I looked at this room, the more I realized that something was not right here. I was not feeling good about this situation, so I left the room, reaching for my phone in my pockets to call it in. The place had most likely been ransacked or robbed. But as I stepped out of the room, I heard the floor creak toward the front of the building. It only creaks when you walk on it. Someone was still there. Before I could react or even unlock my phone, there was a dark shadow to my left and a splitting pain in the side of my head. Then nothing but darkness. When I finally came to, I was lying on the ground in the dark. I didn't turn on a lot of lights when I worked. I liked it when it was dim, and besides, I didn't need to turn on every light as I cleaned. In that place, I would just turn on the hallway light and the light in the room that I was cleaning. But when I woke up, all the lights were off. I remember I turned my head, making sure to not make any noise, and looked around the room. I didn't see anyone or hear the floors creaking, so I stood up. Thankfully, my phone was still on the ground, close to where I fell, and I snatched it up immediately. I was surprised. I had been out for almost an hour. God knows what could have happened in that time. After assessing the situation, and the knot on the side of my head, and no blood, I took off. I left everything in there as is, along with my stuff, and booked it to my car. Thankfully, I always kept my phone and keys on me. Once in my car, I called my boss to tell him what had happened, and then the cops. I sat in my car and watched the place to see if I could see any movement inside, or if anyone left, but I never did. I don't know if I was relieved by that or disappointed. The cops showed up pretty quickly, seeing as there was a police station within a short distance. As I was telling them what had happened, I saw my boss and another man approaching. It was apparently one of the lawyers. I started my story over to explain to them what I had witnessed, and the lawyer confirmed the office that I described was his. I was asked to stay outside with my boss while the two cops went in with the lawyer. While they were gone, I had another officer come over and ask me to give a statement, so I explained it all to him as well. I remember him asking me to be very specific about the times and what I saw. Once I finished, he patted me down and handcuffed me. I was confused and worried. Why was I being put in handcuffs? He said that I wasn't being arrested and that it was just for precaution, but I was still confused. I had called it in. I had been attacked. After some time, the cops and the lawyers walked back out. The lawyer looked a bit concerned or frazzled while the other cop that I hadn't yet talked to approached me and asked me to go over things again. By now, I'm annoyed, confused, and worried. Not to mention my head was still killing me. A paramedic had come over and checked on me too, making sure I didn't have a concussion. They gave me an ice pack or something, but it still hurt. Their tone was making me increasingly nervous. They weren't treating me like a victim. They were treating me like a suspect. I started second-guessing everything as they questioned me. Did I do something wrong? Something that would make them think that I was the culprit too? The paramedics ended up taking me to the hospital to make sure that I didn't have a concussion, but I was still nervous about the whole situation. I know I didn't destroy that office, but then I remembered how I did touch the handle with my bare hand. What if they lifted prints and found mine? Would they think it was me the entire time? The more I dwelled on it, the more guilty I felt, even though I knew I did nothing wrong. I was given the rest of that week off per my boss's orders, and just waited for someone to show up at my door and arrest me. Instead, I got a call from my boss, and after asking how I was doing, he asked me to come in. I felt physically fine after that first day, so I drove myself. He actually relieved so much of the stress from those past few days. He probably told me more than he was supposed to, but I appreciated it. At first, the suspicion of me being involved was completely gone. He had actually backed me up to not only the cops, but the lawyer too. The lawyer, however, was pretty quick to agree that I had nothing to do with it. In fact, he was pretty confident that it was probably a disgruntled client, or maybe even a defendant, because nothing of monetary value was taken. The computers and other electronics were untouched. It was specifically his office and his files. And the other two offices hadn't been touched either. I was relieved. My name was cleared and I could go back to working knowing no one would think that I was going through their property. But it was still a crazy thought, though, that they would just happen to show up at 2 in the morning, or a little earlier than that even, and I would show up to ruin their plans. The funny thing was, I usually cleaned their office every other Friday, but they were closed that week for some reason, and didn't want to pay for a service where there wouldn't be much to do. So they had me come in the next Friday, the Friday that I wouldn't normally go in. It was literally a wrong place, wrong time situation. I continued working, and I even continued cleaning their place. I was just a little more aware of my surroundings. Before I start cleaning, I will walk around to each room and make sure the place is completely empty before I get started. I later learned from my boss that they did catch the guy that broke in, and it was someone that they were suing. Obviously, I don't want to give out names or locations that would get me into trouble, but basically, they tried to steal the information they had on him to give to his lawyer. But his lawyer reported it, knowing he wouldn't be able to use the information anyways. Apparently my boss had gotten pretty close to our clients, or maybe he knew them all along. I wasn't entirely sure. But that's my story. I got knocked out while cleaning and almost accused of robbing the place. But the dude that did it was pretty stupid, and got caught anyways, and I kept my job. Let's just say that he better hope that we never meet again. Hey, I've been listening since 2020, and you do some great work. Thank you. I've been delivering food at night for the better part of a year. It started out as me getting some extra cash, and now I do it just to make ends meet. Bills have gone up. Most of the time it goes without a hitch. I do my work, get paid, and sometimes a nice tip, and then go about my day or night. Thus far, I haven't had any Karens or weird behavior, except one time. Nothing serious, like what I'm going to tell you about. I picked up the food like usual and followed the GPS to their location. They wanted me to knock and then leave it on their front step. Pretty easy and minimal human contact. I pulled up and saw a row of dark houses. The street itself was dark too. My headlights were the only lights going in, and I instantly felt unsafe. I'm not one to judge. I've seen some bad spots myself, and I thought they may have wanted to save on the electric bill. Normally when people see me arrive, they're looking out the blinds or the curtains at me, but they were dead quiet. I sent a message telling them that I had arrived. They told me to place it on the step. The lead up to the driveway had bushes on the path, making it hard to see, and I didn't like that. During the day, it probably wouldn't have been so bad. I sent another message. Hey, can you turn on a light, or can you come down to the car? It was quiet, and I watched those 3 dots bounce. Either they were slow at typing, or finally it came up with a single word. No. I was mad when I saw it and struck the side of my car. I took a photo for evidence, hoping that I wouldn't lose the fee, and contacted the delivery company, telling them I felt unsafe, and I left. I checked the receipt and saw that the meal in total came to about $40. I wasn't going to risk my life for that. I expected a dispute, but there was nothing. No negative review came up either. The only thing that did was a notice to be careful when delivering to that area. Realistically, they could have blacklisted the street if they wanted to. I did some more investigations, and it turns out that other delivery drivers had been sent down that street, and most, like me, had the sense to get out of there. Well, except for two. A man and a woman who had since gone missing. Where I live is kind of known as a hotspot for human trafficking, so most locals know to be wary around the sketchy areas, but these two were from out of town. I still deliver, as I have to, but I'm cautious, and I carry to ensure that I'll be safe. Sometimes I'll bring a friend with me to make sure that I'm okay. My girlfriend has also asked me to come too, but I've refused her. My friend and I decided to drive past the houses during the day. He heard the stories, so we made our way down the street. It was quiet, and the houses all looked abandoned. Many were boarded up or had the windows broken. Other than two burnt-out cars, ours was the only vehicle on that street. I realized how the streetlights weren't working properly that night. I pulled up in front of that house with the bushes, and in daylight, it was hard to see. People could have definitely been hiding in there. I nearly drove off when my friend smacked my arm and pointed to the yellow police tape around the scene. He wanted to get out and go check it, but I said no. I drove away before he could actually get out, and we haven't been back since. I didn't Google any more of what happened, and I really don't want to know. As soon as I can get a job that earns more, I'm not going to be delivering anymore. But that's my story. Anyway, should I go into the creepy houses, Raven? I guess I could have another story for you if I do. Just kidding. I'm not gonna go in. By the way, I listen to your stories during these long drives, and hopefully someday I'll get to hear mine, too. Well, here you go. So that, my friends, was a collection of some night shift horror stories, scary night shift stories, stories that happen while working at night. Yeah. The worst thing that ever happened to me working at night, actually there were a couple things. I used to deliver for Pizza Hut back, like right out of high school, whenever I was in college, the first year or two. I didn't deliver for the first year or two. It was very short, but it was during that time is what I mean. And one of the drivers ended up going to do a delivery and she got robbed. She never came back, obviously. And I remember the managers were mad about that fact. Like, she was robbed at gunpoint. They took the money and they were mad she didn't come back to give them, like, the pizza or the cash or whatever she had on her. It's like, no, she was robbed, so she probably didn't have anything on her after that. And yeah, she didn't come back because she was probably traumatized, but, you know, that's just me. The other thing, I mean, this wasn't a horror story, was just working Blockbuster and doing the inventory. I did that too. That was pretty horrible. Started at 10 p.m. and went until 8 in the morning, and yeah. I didn't know it was going to go till 8 in the morning. I wasn't told that was going to happen. And I had to work the, 4 hours of 4 from, 6 to 10, so I worked 6 to 10, and then 10 to 8. I was very tired that day. Very unhappy. Because they made me listen to the soundtrack to Top Gun for 4 hours of that time. That was hell. I'll be honest with you, that was hell. Yeah. Anyways, those are my two night shift stories that sucked. Pizza Hut one was obviously worse because she got robbed. I wasn't robbed. I wasn't part of that, so. The Blockbuster one was just it was a horror story of a different kind, if you will. Anyways. Hopefully you all enjoyed the stories. If you did, please do hit that like button. If you're new to this channel and would like to hear more like this, please do subscribe. I post at least 3 times a week, typically. Sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more, depending on how the week goes. Usually 3 is where I average it out, though. I also do have a podcast side of this, which is over on Spotify, Audible, and all those, Apple, Pandora, etc. It's the same content, it's just presented differently. Typically, one episode over there is 2 videos here on YouTube, so longer form, same stories, a little different. You can also leave me a comment if you're feeling bold and want to let me know how you're doing or what you thought of the stories. You can also join Patreon or memberships, get early access to content like this. Also, patrons and members get early access to my novel, my story that I've been writing. It is a full novel. I am finished with it. I will be uploading the rest of the chapters here very soon for them to read, the last 4 chapters. It is a 22-chapter with an epilogue as well novel, about 375 pages. I designed the cover today, and I'm very happy with how it looks, so that will be ready very soon. I'm thinking a January launch is imminent, so if any of you guys like my actual, fiction stories that I've written over on Raven Pasta or that I have on here, yeah, this is very much my style. And it's a psychological story, psychological thriller, kind of-ish, psychological. I hesitate to say horror, but it's psychological, I will say that. Yeah, and I've been working on it for a while. This original idea came to me back in, 2019, 2018, and I just didn't do it, and then I started on it at some point, and then started on it again last year, the beginning of the year, so it's going almost 2 years for this idea, unfortunately. I had to rewrite everything I wrote because it sucked, but, but yeah, I'm done, so hopefully you guys can look forward to that. If just 2 of you buy it, then I will consider it a success, is my point. Hopefully a few of you do. I probably will also put it on Kindle Unlimited. It will also be digital on Kindle, so, yeah. I think I've talked enough. I'll also have signed copies available on the Coffee link whenever it gets printed, just so you know. So, yeah. All that said, friends, hope you're having a beautiful day. Hope I see you again here very soon, but until then, remember, you are loved, you are valid, you are important, you are the best you that you can be. Do not forget it, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And until next time, my friends, much love, and as always, sleep well.